I never planned to finish my years in the small add-on with the low ceiling and the humming window unit that rattles when the compressor kicks in. But I told myself that life rarely asks permission before it rearranges your furniture, and a man my age ought to learn to make peace with the sound of other people's footsteps above his head. When my wife died, and the house that once felt too tight for us suddenly turned into a cavern, where her perfume lingered in the closet like a kind of ghost, I looked at the pictures on the mantel and understood that walls can echo back at you until you start answering them. So when my daughter said the word sweet, and my son-in-law said, "It's separate, Dad. You'll have your privacy," I nodded as if the decision had been mine, and not the inevitable consequence of silence falling too hard on a widower's chest. The place is technically a converted garage, though my daughter insists on calling it the garden room. It has a bathroom where the hot water runs out faster than the soap rinses off, a kitchenette with a 2-burner stove that cycles red to black like it has opinions about how much heat I deserve, and a narrow window that frames a strip of lawn, a stubborn patch of hostas, and the fence beyond which a neighbor's dog patrols like a soldier, convinced the war will return at any moment. In the morning I wake early, not because I must, but because old men do, and I make coffee the way Margaret liked it, measuring by muscle memory and grief. And then I sit at the little table that folds against the wall and listen to the house stirring above me, the soft beat of my daughter's steps as she moves from bedroom to hallway, the heavier tread of her husband crossing to the kitchen, the cabinets opening and closing with the quick authority of people on their way to a day that belongs to them. I go up when invited or when there's a pretext like taking out the trash or checking the gutters, because I have learned that a man who is tolerated must invent errands that make his presence useful, and usefulness is the currency that buys you 10 minutes at the kitchen counter with your granddaughter before the bus, or a nod from your son-in-law when the lawn looks squared away and the edges are clean. The children, Grace with her hair in an impatient ponytail, and Sam still growing into his feet, treat me with an absent kindness like the courtesy you extend to the flag you pass each morning. You salute without considering who sewed it. I try not to mind. I tell stories when someone asks, though fewer people ask than used to. And when I do tell one, I edit out the parts that make my daughter tense. The cigarette on the troopship deck, the brawl over the spilled tray in the chow hall, the way a man can love his buddies so fiercely that it breaks him a little to leave them behind. My health is, according to my doctor, pretty good for 75, which sounds like a compliment until you hear the soft surprise tucked inside it. I take pills with names that sound like small towns. I walk the block when the weather cooperates, and I keep Margaret's Bible beside the bed, not to bargain or plead, but to hold, because the leather has taken my hand's shape, and anything you hold long enough becomes proof that you once fit somewhere. I know the rhythms of the neighborhood now the way I once knew the order of inspections before a convoy. The leaf blower that starts precisely at 7:30 on Thursdays, the school traffic that makes the cul-de-sac flare with brake lights half an hour later, the Amazon van that treats the street like a runway, and the driver like a pilot landing on an aircraft carrier. I have tools in a neat row, labeled in my own shaky hand, because my son-in-law believes a tidy workbench is a sign of a sober mind. And I suppose he's right about that, although I've noticed that his tidiness has the brittle shine of something learned recently under pressure. My daughter brings me lists on index cards, light bulb in hallway, drawer that sticks, faucet that drips, and she thanks me in that quick, efficient way that professionals thank you when you have held the elevator, grateful for the convenience rather than the person. And I tell myself that gratitude, like heat from the 2-burner stove, is enough if you lean close and don't ask it to last. On Sundays, when the marching band from the nearby high school practices in the parking lot and the brass climbs over the houses in bright, insistent waves, I sometimes sit on the step and think about the old place we sold after Margaret's funeral, and how the pecan tree out back dropped leaves like confetti every fall, and how I raked them into piles shaped like small boats, and the grandkids, when they were little, would leap until the boats were gone. My daughter says the add-on is safer for me because there are fewer stairs, and she says the neighborhood is better for everyone because the schools test higher and the lawns match. And I nod because my job these days is to nod, and because love has many dialects, and one of them is logistics. When I first moved in, I told myself that the arrangement would give them breathing room and give me company, that we would eat together a few nights a week, and I would teach Sam how to oil a baseball glove and Grace how to check the tire pressure before a long drive. And even if these lessons happened only once a month, it would be enough to stitch the days into a pattern. But patterns require thread. And what we have, more often than not, is a seam that looks straight from across the room and turns out to be held by two stubborn pins. I am not naive about the discomfort of another man sleeping under your roof, even if he is your wife's father and pays for his groceries and the utilities out of a pension that embarrasses him with its adequacy. I know that a house, like a marriage, needs clear borders, and I maintain mine the way a soldier maintains a perimeter, alert but unobtrusive, keeping my radio low and my boots laced. And yet there are moments when the border feels like a one-way mirror, when I can see into their life, but they cannot see back into mine. I remember Margaret asking me, when our daughter was in high school and had a talent for doors that closed harder than physics demanded, what we would do when she grew up and needed us less. And I said the thing fathers say, we'll wait until she needs us again, as if need were a tide you could chart. And now here I am, waiting, which in the mouth of an old man is not a verb so much as a residence. The photographs inside the main house tell a story that I am in, but not central to. Wedding over the courthouse steps. The newborn swaddled like conclusions. A Halloween where everyone was coordinated and I stood at the edge of the frame as a scarecrow because they needed someone to hold the porch light pull while they posed. And it occurs to me that this is what old age is for those of us who are still mobile and basically sound. The gradual migration to the margin, the slow apprenticeship in quieting your opinions until they are useful, and your jokes until they are quick. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the low murmur of my daughter and her husband talking in the kitchen, and though I try not to listen, I can tell the difference between a conversation about bills and a conversation about me. The first has arithmetic in it, clicks and totals, while the second has size, and I lie there beneath them measuring the distance between concern and resentment, a distance that is smaller than you think and can be crossed without anyone noticing until they bump a chair and say, with exaggerated cheer, "Morning, Dad," and you say it back like you're stepping off a curb you know is higher than it looks. I keep track of small goodnesses because a man who has seen too much of the other thing knows the value of inventory. The way Grace once brought me a daisy she uprooted from the crack in the sidewalk and said it was a survivor like me. The way Sam, when he thought no one was watching, picked up the neighbor's trash cans that had tipped in the wind. The extra slice of meatloaf my daughter wrapped in foil and sent down, even though she would later pretend she hadn't, as if kindness were contraband. I write letters to Margaret that I don't mail. I keep them in a shoebox under the bed because it's a cliché and because clichés are just truths that wore out. And in those letters I describe the ordinary day with the seriousness of a man logging the weather on a submarine, because the ordinary, when you have lost the extraordinary, becomes holy in its own plain way. It would be dishonest to claim that everything in me is patience and gratitude. There are afternoons when the air in the add-on feels thin and my own breath sounds like someone else's. When I miss the authority of a job where your hands told the truth and your back paid the tithe. And I miss my wife's steady hand on the steering wheel of a conversation that would otherwise swerve into a ditch. I have learned to swallow the words that begin with "when I was your age," because they taste of judgment and defeat. And I know how young people hear them as a preface to a verdict, and I do not want to be judge or jury. I want to be the man who fixes the drawer that sticks and knows where the shut-off valve is and can teach a boy to tie a proper knot if the boy ever asks. There are days I think he will. There are days I am sure he won't. Both kinds of days end, one way or the other, with me rinsing a mug and turning off a lamp and feeling the murmur of the family over my head, like rain on a tent, neither friendly nor hostile. Simply there, the sound that defines the space you occupy. If you ask me why I stayed after the first awkward month, after the first careless remark that lodged like a splinter, I would tell you that staying is a profession for my generation, that we stayed in marriages and jobs and towns because leaving used to mean something. It doesn't always mean now. And because I believed that a man could earn his place through dependable service the way you earn trust in a squad, showing up clean and on time and quiet, taking your share of the load and a little more, and that eventually the house would relax around me the way the ground relaxes around a fence post that has been there long enough. Perhaps that is happening, slowly and invisibly. Perhaps I am sinking in a different way. I suppose we will find out. For now, I keep a schedule on an index card taped beside the door, trash days, school concert dates, the time the mail usually comes. And I write my granddaughter's science fair in blue and my grandson's game in green, so that the small obligations of belonging look like something cheerful when I glance at them. And I iron a shirt on Friday night, because Saturday morning sometimes brings pancakes, and if there are pancakes, there may be laughter. And if there is laughter, even the rattling window unit learns to keep its voice down. The shift began so quietly that I almost missed it. The way a clock in another room begins to lose seconds you don't notice until one day you are late without understanding why. It was late autumn, the kind that smelled of leaves ground into the pavement and the faint smoke of backyard fire pits. My daughter had taken a new position at the hospital, which meant long shifts and a constant tiredness around her eyes. Her husband, Dean, was between jobs, as he liked to say, though what that meant in practice was long afternoons in front of the television and nights that ended with empty bottles clinking into the recycling bin. I told myself that unemployment can make a man brittle, and that the best thing an old father can do is stay out of the way. Dean and I had always kept a cautious distance, an arm's-length politeness that worked as long as it didn't have to bear weight. He was a big man, too young to be soft, yet already sliding into the bulk that comes from sitting and stewing. When he laughed, it was with his whole face. But when he was angry, which was happening more often, his face seemed to close, like a fist. The first time it happened, it was almost trivial. Grace had left her bicycle behind my car, and when I went to back out for a grocery run, I bent the front wheel. I carried the bike up to the porch, knocked on the door, and apologized, offering to pay for the repair. Dean opened the door in his T-shirt, his eyes already half narrowed, a can sweating in his hand. "You should look where you're going," he said, his tone flat but heavy. I said it was an accident, that I'd take it to the shop. He looked at the bent wheel and then at me, and the way he exhaled through his nose made something old in me tighten. The sound of a man measuring whether he can safely humiliate you. "You break things," he said, "and then you act surprised. Maybe you shouldn't be driving anymore." I nodded, because there is no safe answer to a man who needs to hear himself right. I went to the hardware store, bought a new wheel, fixed it myself, and left the bike in the driveway like an offering. That night, when I heard laughter from the kitchen, I told myself it was about something else. After that, the air in the house began to change temperature without the thermostat moving. My daughter, Emily, started calling less from upstairs, preferring to text when she needed something fixed. When I joined them for dinner, Dean answered my attempts at conversation with the kind of short sounds you make to a dog you don't want to encourage. He had begun working out again, weights in the garage thudding in the evening while the radio played classic rock. And sometimes, when I passed to take the trash out, he would pause mid-set, watch me over his shoulder, and then resume, louder than before. I didn't know then that this kind of watching is its own form of violence, a rehearsal for the moment when you stop being a person and become an object that can be moved, corrected, or struck without consequence. The true catalyst came in February, a night wrapped in the hush that comes before snow. Emily had gone in for an overnight shift, and the kids were already asleep. I was in my room reading by the small lamp that hums like a distant wasp when I heard a knock on my door. Not the quick double tap of courtesy, but a single, heavy thud. Dean stood there, filling the frame, a shadow of cigarette smoke and impatience clinging to him. "You leave the garage light on again?" he asked. I said I didn't think so. "You did," he said, stepping inside without invitation, his eyes already scanning the small space as if looking for evidence of my guilt. "Electricity costs money, old man." The phrase stung not for its cruelty, but for its familiarity. I had used almost those same words decades ago, scolding my daughter when she was 9 and left the porch light burning all night. I started to say I'd check it right away, but he moved closer. "You think I made a cache? You freeload here all day." "Freeload?" I said it quietly, surprised at the heat in my own voice. "I pay my way, Dean. The bills, the groceries." He cut me off with a laugh that sounded like something being thrown. "You think that covers it? You live under my roof, eat at my table. Don't start acting like you're doing us favors." Under his roof. The word sank in. Technically, the mortgage still carried my name as a co-signer, but that kind of truth doesn't hold up in a man's fury. I stepped back, meaning to end the conversation, but my shoulder hit the wall. He noticed. Some men can't resist a corner once they see one. "Look at you," he said softly. "Always judging, always watching me like I'm some kind of disappointment." His finger jabbed toward my chest, then stayed there, pressing through the fabric of my shirt, the smell of beer sour on his breath. "You think I don't see it? The way you look at her, you think she'd be better off if it was just you two again, huh?" I tried to speak, but the words stuck. The hand that had been pointing suddenly flattened against my chest and shoved. It wasn't hard enough to knock me down, just enough to claim the space, to remind me of the imbalance. Then another shove, harder. My back hit the wall. My breath caught. For a second, he seemed startled by his own strength, then satisfied by it. He stepped back, muttered something like, "Watch yourself," and left, the door swinging half shut behind him. I stayed there a long time, feeling the thud of my heart against the spot his hand had been. And when I finally looked in the mirror, the skin over my collarbone had a small bruise blooming, like an accusation. The next morning he acted as though nothing had happened, humming in the kitchen, pouring cereal for the kids. My daughter looked tired, distracted. When she noticed me rubbing my shoulder, she asked if I'd slept wrong. I almost told her. But then Dean looked up from his bowl, his eyes unreadable, and I said yes, just a cramp. I told myself it was an isolated incident, a misunderstanding carried too far. a man's bad night spilling into someone else's morning. I've seen worse tempers contained again by daylight. But daylight does not heal what has been permitted. It only teaches you how to hide it. After that night, he began to treat the house as a territory to be patrolled. If I left a dish in the sink, he would comment on it. If I forgot to lock the back door, he would bring it up at dinner, phrased as concern, but sharpened with ridicule. My daughter avoided confrontation, folding her silence into domestic tasks, scrubbing the counter as if polish could erase tension. Once, when I offered to watch the kids so they could have a night out, she said no too quickly and then added, "You need rest, Dad." That was when I realized she had stopped seeing me as the man who built her swing set and started seeing me as someone who might cause trouble simply by existing. The weather turned colder, and my joints complained louder, but I still cleared the walk each morning, partly from pride, partly because work is the last prayer of the lonely. Dean stopped saying thank you. He began calling me sir, but not the way soldiers say it. His version was an insult wrapped in politeness. "Yes, sir," he'd say when I asked him to pass the salt, or "No, sir, wouldn't want to bother you," when I offered to help with something. Each sir carried the weight of a dare. I started spending more time in my room, pretending to read, listening to the house creak and the television laugh tracks spill through the vents. The children came down less often. I told myself they were busy with school, but sometimes I caught them glancing toward their father before answering me, as if waiting for permission to be kind. The second incident was louder. Dean had been drinking again, and the game on television had gone badly for his team. I was in the kitchen making tea when he came in, eyes glassy, jaw tight. "You take the last beer?" he asked. I said I didn't drink beer. "You sure about that?" He opened the fridge, stared at the rows of condiments, then slammed it shut. "One's missing." I tried to step past him, but he blocked the doorway. "You think I don't notice things, old man? You think I'm stupid?" The word stupid came out thick, dangerous. "I told you, I don't drink," I repeated. The next thing I knew, the cup was on the floor, tea spreading across the tiles, and his hand was around my arm, squeezing hard enough to make my fingers tingle. "You're a liar," he said, and pushed me backward. My hip hit the counter. Pain flared sharp, clean. Then his face changed, as if he'd remembered the children upstairs. He let go, stepped back, wiped his mouth. "You should be more careful," he said, almost kindly, and left me standing amid the shards of porcelain. I cleaned the mess in silence, wrapped the bruise on my arm with a bandage, and told myself again that it would stop, that men like Dean burned hot but short. The next morning he was all smiles, calling me Buddy in front of the kids, asking if I wanted to go with him to the hardware store. I said no. He shrugged and left. My daughter kissed my cheek on her way out and said, "Thank you for being patient with him." It was the only time she acknowledged that patience was required. That night I wrote another letter to Margaret and did not sign it, because signing your name to a secret feels like asking for judgment. That was the catalyst, though I didn't know it then. Violence, like rust, begins where the paint looks only slightly scratched. I had spent my life believing that endurance was virtue, that if you kept your head down, the storm would pass. But storms don't pass when someone keeps opening the window to let them back in. From that night on, every sound in the house carried potential. The slam of a cupboard could be anger. The creak of the stairs could be approach. I learned to breathe quietly, to move without echo, to leave no trace of my small routines. The bruise on my arm turned yellow, then green, then disappeared. But I could still feel its outline, like the memory of a hand that once meant harm, and might again. I began to understand that my silence had become his permission, and that my daughter's silence was worse. It was belief disguised as loyalty. It is strange how a pattern of cruelty can become domestic, how something that should feel shocking starts to blend into the furniture of your life, until you can no longer tell the difference between fear and habit. After the winter of small shoves and muttered insults came a spring that seemed to promise reprieve. The snow melted into slow rivers along the curb. The children played basketball in the driveway again, and I allowed myself to believe that maybe Dean had exhausted whatever anger had been eating at him. For a few weeks he was almost civil, saying good morning when he passed my window, even helping me carry a box of old tools from the shed. I remember thinking that men like him were volcanoes that sometimes burned themselves out, that you could learn to live on their slopes if you moved carefully enough. But calm, as I discovered, is only the surface tension of a new disaster forming underneath. It started with the mail. My pension check had always been deposited directly into my account. But one afternoon Dean came to my door holding an envelope. "This came for you," he said, his voice casual, but his eyes narrowed in that way that always meant something was coming. I took it, thanked him, and began to close the door. But he stopped it with his hand. "Mind if I ask how much they pay you these days for sitting around?" he asked, his tone light but his mouth already tightening into a smirk. I said that wasn't his concern, that I handled my own bills. He nodded, still smiling. "Just curious. You know, Emily's been covering a lot lately. Kids' school, groceries, utilities. I figure since you're living here rent-free, maybe you could pitch in a little more." I told him I already did my share. He laughed. "Sure, you fix things, but that's pocket change compared to real costs." He leaned closer. "We're family, right? Families help each other." That phrase, "families help each other," became his refrain. Every few days he found new ways to make me feel like a debtor in my own bloodline. If I left the porch light on, he'd remind me that electricity wasn't free. If the kids outgrew shoes, he'd sigh loud enough for me to hear. One night when Emily was at work, he knocked again, this time holding a stack of unpaid bills. "You could cover a couple of these," he said. I told him I'd already given Emily money last month for groceries. "You think that's enough?" he said, voice sharpening. "You sit here warm and fed while she's killing herself at that hospital. You think your little handouts make up for the roof over your head?" I reached for my wallet, because the truth is that shame still worked on me like a reflex. But he snatched the bills back. "Forget it," he said. "You're too proud." Then softer. "But pride doesn't keep the lights on." He turned away, leaving the papers scattered on the table. I gathered them, noticed half were dated months ago, and addressed to him alone, not to Emily, and I understood that whatever hole he dug for himself was deeper than I'd realized. By early summer, the arguments stopped pretending to be about money. They were about territory now. I would come upstairs to find my tools moved, my mail opened, my coffee can emptied and replaced with a cheaper brand. The children began to mirror the new order, speaking to me in cautious, deferential tones, glancing at their father before laughing at one of my stories. Grace stopped visiting my room altogether. One afternoon she stood at the threshold, said she couldn't stay because Mom says it's better if you rest, and then ran off before I could answer. That was when I noticed that my daughter, my own flesh, had started to disappear into avoidance. Her silences had grown strategic. When Dean was home, she busied herself with chores, always moving, always tired. When he was away, she sat at the kitchen table staring at nothing, as if her thoughts had to stay unspoken to remain safe. The first truly humiliating incident happened on Father's Day. Emily had planned a small dinner, roast chicken, the kind she knew I liked, and even bought a card that said, "To the best dad," though I suspected it had been chosen in haste. Dean came home late, the smell of whiskey already announcing him before the door opened. The kids were halfway through dessert. He stumbled slightly, caught himself, and looked at the table with a kind of sneering amusement. "Celebrating, are we?" he asked. Emily tensed. "Just dinner, Dean. For Dad." He grinned at me, sat down opposite, and reached for the chicken leg with his bare hand. "To Dad," he said, lifting it like a toast. "The man of the hour. The man of every hour, if you ask him." The children giggled nervously. I smiled politely, thinking it best not to react. Then he said, "Tell us again about Vietnam, huh? How many people you saved? Or was it how many you lost? I can never keep your hero story straight." Emily whispered, "Dean, stop." He waved her off. "No, let him tell it. He loves that one. The brave soldier routine. The only war I've seen him fight is with the thermostat." Something inside me cracked, not with anger, but with the exhaustion of dignity being stripped one layer at a time. I said quietly, "That's enough." He leaned across the table, close enough that I could see the blood vessels spidering in his eyes. "You think you can tell me what's enough? You're a guest here. Remember that." He shoved his chair back so hard it scraped the tile. Emily flinched. "Dean, please." He left the room, and we all sat frozen, the clock ticking loud as artillery. A few minutes later we heard a crash in the garage, metal against concrete. Emily went to him, but I stayed with the kids, who stared at me as if I were something fragile that might break if they looked too long. After that night, I stopped eating dinner upstairs. I told them it was easier to manage my diet separately, but the truth was simpler. Humiliation spoils appetite. Dean seemed to take my retreat as confirmation of his authority. He started calling me the tenant. "Tenant's out early today," he'd say when I mowed the lawn. "Hope the tenant remembers to pay his rent," when I brought in groceries. Emily tried to joke it away, but the laughter in her throat was dry. One evening she came down with a casserole, her eyes red. "He's under a lot of pressure," she said. "He's trying, Dad." I wanted to ask her what trying meant when all the effort went into breaking someone else down. But instead, I just nodded and told her to take care of herself. She squeezed my hand and left before tears could finish forming. The physical cruelty returned on a humid July night. Dean had been drinking again, sitting on the porch steps long after dark, smoking and muttering to himself. I had been reading, but couldn't concentrate. The tension in the air was thick, a storm waiting for a spark. When I finally stepped outside to throw away some trash, he looked up. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" he said. The question came out of nowhere. I said I didn't understand. He stood, unsteady but deliberate. "You sit down there in your little room, judging. You think I don't see it." He came closer. I could smell the liquor. "You talk to Emily like I'm not in the room, like she's still your little girl and I'm some kind of intruder." I said nothing, because anything would have been wrong. His voice rose. "You poisoned her against me. You always have. You think she'd have me if you hadn't guilted her into it? You think she really loves me?" I told him to go to bed. That was my mistake. His hand came up faster than I could move, the back of it catching my cheek with a sound that seemed to echo inside my skull. I staggered, not from the force, but from the shock of it, the sudden certainty that something sacred had just ended. He didn't hit me again, just stood there breathing hard, eyes wild. "You ever talk to her about me again," he said, "I'll make you wish you hadn't." He turned and went inside, leaving me on the porch with the taste of blood in my mouth. I sat there until dawn, pressing a cold cloth against my face, watching the sky lighten without feeling anything at all. The next morning, Emily saw the mark and gasped. "What happened?" she whispered. I told her I'd slipped on the porch steps. She didn't believe me, not really, but she wanted to. Belief is easier when it keeps the peace. That evening I overheard them arguing in the kitchen, low voices, then the sound of glass breaking. Later she came to my door, eyes swollen. "Please, Dad, just stay out of his way," she said. "He's under stress." I almost laughed, but the sound died in my throat. I realized she was frightened too, only her fear wore the costume of loyalty. After that, Dean tightened his control over the house. He changed the locks on the garage and said it was for security. He told the kids they weren't to bother me without asking. He even started collecting the mail himself. My world shrank to 4 walls and the small window facing the street. I made excuses to neighbors who used to wave, telling them I was just tired, that I preferred quiet. One afternoon, Mrs. Phelps from 2 doors down knocked, bringing cookies, and I caught a glimpse of Dean watching through the curtain, his face expressionless. I didn't invite her in. Later he mentioned it casually. "No need to have people over, old man. We've got enough gossip without you feeding them stories." I began to lose track of days. My sleep grew thin, full of half-dreams, where Margaret's voice tried to tell me something I couldn't quite hear. I took to writing again, but the letters became shorter, just fragments. "I'm still here. He's winning. Forgive me for not leaving sooner." One night I heard a sound like someone trying a doorknob. I sat up, heart pounding, but no one came in. In the morning I found muddy footprints outside my door and the faint smell of smoke. When I confronted Dean, he shrugged. "You must have left it unlocked," he said. "Old folks forget things." That was when I understood he was trying to make me doubt myself, to turn every protest into proof of weakness. The humiliation reached its quietest and cruelest form at the end of August. Emily had gone to a conference for 3 days, and the house was his entirely. On the second night, he came to my door again, drunk but calm. "You know," he said, "I could call the state. Tell them you're losing it. Tell them you left the stove on, wandered off. They'd love that. They'd put you somewhere with soft walls, feed you pudding till you die." He smiled as he said it, like a man describing the weather. "You'd better remember who takes care of you." Then he turned and left, whistling. I sat awake until morning, staring at the door, wondering how far he would go and how much of me would be left when he did. The bruises healed, the words lingered, and somewhere inside me, a small decision began to form. Not yet courage, but its shadow. I had spent my life believing silence was strength, that a man's endurance measured his worth. But there are kinds of silence that rot you from within, that turn patience into complicity. I wasn't ready to speak yet, not to Emily, not to anyone, but I had stopped telling myself that what was happening was just a phase. The line between fear and shame had blurred, and I could no longer pretend not to see it. It happened in late September, on one of those evenings when the light fades too early and everything in the house seems to hum with a tired kind of waiting. The air was thick, almost metallic, and the sky outside my narrow window hung low and yellow, the way it does before a thunderstorm that never quite arrives. Emily had gone to work again, and the kids were upstairs finishing homework. Dean had been drinking since noon, pacing from room to room, the dull thud of his footsteps moving like a pendulum through the house. I could hear him muttering under his breath, fragments of sentences aimed at no one, but weighted enough to make the walls listen. I remember thinking that the air itself seemed afraid to move too quickly around him. I stayed in my room, reading the same line of a newspaper for an hour, trying to breathe quietly, as if noise could summon him. But some people don't need a reason to strike. They only need silence long enough to imagine one. Around 9, I heard the back door slam. A few minutes later, my own door opened without knocking. He stood there, eyes red, shirt half-buttoned, the smell of whiskey and sweat radiating from him. "You been talking to her?" he asked. His voice was quiet, but it had that dangerous calm that men like him mistake for control. I asked what he meant. "Don't play dumb," he said, stepping closer. "Emily, you've been telling her stories, trying to make me look bad." I told him that wasn't true. "You think I don't know how she looks at me after you whisper your pity to her? You think I don't hear you in her head when she argues?" I tried to stand, but he shoved me back down into the chair, his hand pressing my shoulder hard enough to make the joint burn. "You old bastard," he hissed. "You've been turning her against me since the day I met you." His breath was hot, sour. "You can't stand that she chose me over you." Something in me snapped, though not in the way he expected. I laughed, not mockingly, but helplessly, because the accusation was so insane it folded in on itself. That small sound of disbelief pushed him over whatever edge he'd been circling. His fist came down across my face, sharp and blinding. I fell sideways out of the chair, my head hitting the corner of the table. For a moment the world was pure white noise, not pain yet, just absence. Then sound returned all at once, his ragged breathing, the ticking clock, the blood pounding in my ears. He stood over me, chest heaving, his face already changing from fury to calculation. "You hit me first," he said suddenly, his tone rehearsed, as though laying down a record. "You came at me, remember that." I didn't answer. I couldn't. My lip was split, and I could feel something wrong in my ribs when I tried to breathe. He left, slamming the door so hard the frame rattled. I sat there on the floor, hand pressed to my side, watching the blood from my nose drip onto the rug. It was the same rug Emily had given us for our anniversary 20 years earlier, back when Margaret was still alive. I remember thinking that blood had no place on something so ordinary, and that the smallest details of domestic life can turn into monuments of shame when you're forced to live inside them. When I finally got to my feet, I went to the bathroom mirror. My face looked like it belonged to someone else, swollen, red, an old man's features rearranged by someone else's rage. I cleaned myself as best I could and wrapped a towel around my ribs. The pain was deep, dull, rhythmic, like the heartbeat of something trying to escape. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? That my son-in-law had hit me? That I was 75 and afraid of being called a liar in my own daughter's house? The humiliation of even imagining the conversation made my stomach twist. Instead, I put on my coat and walked outside, into the sharp night air. The street was quiet, every house closed up in its own warm little secret. I walked to the corner and stood beneath the street light until the dizziness passed. The light buzzed above me like a warning I couldn't read. My breath came in shallow bursts, and every step sent a shudder through my ribs. I ended up at the park 3 blocks away, sitting on a bench beside the empty swing set. I used to bring Grace and Sam here when they were small. They would race each other to the top of the slide, and Margaret would sit beside me, handing out juice boxes and smiling like the world was fixed in place. That night, though, the park looked like a photograph left in the rain, its edges blurred and meaningless. I sat there for nearly an hour before I could convince myself to go back. When I returned, the house was dark. Dean's truck was gone. I locked my door for the first time since moving in. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face again, that mixture of certainty and contempt. I think that was the moment something inside me shifted irreversibly. Fear had become too familiar. It no longer even registered as fear. What I felt instead was a cold clarity, a sense that the life I had been clinging to was already gone, that the home I thought I had preserved by silence was nothing more than a shelter built from cowardice. The next morning, Emily noticed the bruise immediately. "Dad, what happened?" she asked, touching my cheek gently. I told her I'd fallen while trying to move a box. She frowned but didn't press. Maybe she already knew. That evening, I heard them arguing upstairs. Her voice was trembling, his booming, defensive. Then a door slammed. She came down to my room an hour later, eyes rimmed red. "He said you provoked him," she whispered. "Is that true?" I stared at her, not because of what she'd asked, but because of how softly she said it, like she was afraid of the answer. I said no, of course not. But she looked unconvinced, trapped between two loyalties that should never have had to compete. "Please, Dad," she said finally, "try not to make him angry." That word, try, lodged in me like a splinter, as if keeping the peace was something I had failed at, as if peace were mine to create through obedience. For the next few weeks, Dean's cruelty took on a new texture. He no longer needed to shout or shove. He could hurt me simply by existing. He moved my belongings when I wasn't there. Small things at first, my reading glasses, the remote control, a photograph of Margaret. When I asked if he'd seen them, he'd shrug. "You sure you didn't misplace them?" he'd say, tone light, eyes glittering. Once I found my Bible in the freezer, half soaked through from melting ice. "You should take better care of your things," he said when I showed him. Emily turned away, pretending not to hear. That was the worst part. Not the violence, not even the humiliation, but the way silence became its own language in that house. Every unspoken truth hung in the air like smoke. I began losing time. Some days I wake not remembering if I'd eaten. The bruise on my ribs turned to a deep ache that never fully faded. My doctor, a kind man who had treated me for years, noticed the way I winced when he pressed my side during a routine checkup. "Fall?" he asked. I nodded. "Off the porch," I said. He looked at me for a long moment, then simply said, "You should be more careful." But I saw the doubt in his eyes. As I left, he touched my shoulder lightly, the way a man might steady a friend standing too close to a cliff. "You know," he said, "we can always talk about more than medicine." I thanked him, promised I'd be fine. That night I stared at the business card he'd slipped into my pocket, the number for a social worker who specialized in elder abuse, and then I tore it in half. It felt like betrayal to even hold it. What kept me there was not just fear, but the stubbornness of a generation raised to believe that private suffering was a form of virtue. I told myself I could endure anything if it meant keeping my daughter's family together, that maybe my presence absorbed some of the blows that might otherwise fall on her or the children. But that lie wore thin every time I saw the way Sam flinched when his father's voice rose, or how Grace had learned to tiptoe around him like a cat around a sleeping dog. One night I heard them whispering outside my door. "Why does Dad hate Grandpa?" Sam asked. "He doesn't," Grace said quickly. "He's just stressed." The word again, stressed, like stress were a holy relic capable of excusing any cruelty. The next morning, when Emily drove the kids to school, Dean appeared at my door once more. "We need to talk," he said. I didn't answer. He pushed the door open anyway. "You've been telling lies," he said. "Emily says you fell, but I know you've been talking to people, the doctor, maybe the neighbors. You think you can get me locked up again?" I had forgotten until that moment that he was on parole. The realization flickered in my mind like a struck match. "I haven't talked to anyone," I said, but even the truth sounded defensive. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You ever try something like that? I'll make sure they find you wandering in traffic one night, confused. Old man lost his mind. They'll believe me, not you." He smiled then, a thin, satisfied curve. "You think you've got dignity left, but all I have to do is tell them you're senile, and it's gone." When he left, I sat for a long time without moving, listening to the sound of my own breathing, trying to understand how a man could be erased while still alive. That was the moment the crisis truly settled in. Not the hitting, not the bruises, but the recognition that he was dismantling me piece by piece, and that my daughter, out of fear or shame, was letting him. I had spent my life believing that love could outlast cruelty, that time healed even the most stubborn wounds. But time, I realized, only helps the wounds of those who stop picking at them. For those of us who stay silent, it just makes the rot harder to remove. A week later, Sam came into my room unexpectedly, carrying a school project. He wanted to show me the model airplane he'd built. As he turned to leave, he said, "Mom says not to bother you when Dad's mad." I asked if his dad was mad now. He shrugged. "He's always mad," he said simply, and went upstairs. His small voice cracked something inside me that all the bruises hadn't. That night, when I wrote to Margaret, my hand trembled so much I could barely read the words. "I don't know how much longer I can do this," I wrote. "He's winning. I'm disappearing, and they're pretending not to see." It was then I understood that the line between endurance and surrender had vanished, and that whatever courage I had left would have to grow in the cracks of my fear. I didn't yet know what form that courage would take, only that something inside me refused to die quietly. The crisis wasn't over. It was only just beginning to show me what I was capable of when silence stopped feeling like safety. I think the human heart can get used to almost anything if you give it enough time and enough excuses. For months I had lived in a rhythm of caution that passed for peace, moving through each day as if I were walking on glass floors that might shatter if I breathed too loudly. The days had no real borders anymore. Morning bled into afternoon and into night, each hour another step in the same circle of endurance. Dean's moods came and went like weather fronts, unpredictable, but always with the same aftermath. The smell of liquor, the tension that seemed to make the very air in the house hum. My daughter's face had become a mask of endurance, soft and polite when he was in the room, gray and vacant when he wasn't. The children had learned how to read him, to vanish when his footsteps got heavy. I watched it all and told myself that at least I could absorb some of it, that maybe my being there took a little of the fire off them. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. I wasn't a shield. I was a silent witness, and every day I lost a little more of the strength to even pretend otherwise. By November, the first frost had come, and with it a new layer of hostility that seemed sharper, cleaner, more deliberate. Dean had started locking the refrigerator at night. I woke one morning to find a chain looped through the handles, a padlock snapped in place. "Kids keep sneaking snacks," he said when I asked. "Got to teach them discipline." But I knew it wasn't about the kids. It was about me. I had become a symbol of everything he hated: dependence, old age, a mirror that showed him what he might become when his strength and arrogance were gone. One evening he caught me boiling pasta in my kitchenette and said, "You could have just asked for dinner. We don't like you playing with that stove. One mistake, and the whole place goes up." I said nothing, because any answer would have been wrong. Later, I found that he'd turned off the gas line. When I confronted him, he shrugged. "Safety first," he said. "You forget things sometimes." He began spreading little stories about me, nothing outright cruel, just insidious enough to stick. I overheard him on the phone with someone, maybe a friend, maybe one of his parole officers, saying that I'd been confused lately, that I'd misplaced my wallet 3 times, that he was keeping an eye on the old man. Emily never repeated these things to me, but I saw the way she started double-checking my pills, the way she labeled drawers as if I were already half gone. Once, when I asked if she'd seen my bank card, she hesitated before handing it over. That pause was worse than any slap. It meant she had started to wonder. The holidays were the breaking point. Thanksgiving had always been Margaret's favorite, a day of noise and warmth, of smells that filled the house and made even grief take a back seat. This year, Emily tried to recreate it, but the table was a battlefield disguised as domesticity. Dean had invited one of his old friends, a thick-necked man who laughed too loud and called everyone Buddy. The turkey was dry, the air heavy with unspoken things. I sat at the far end, carving small bites I could swallow without choking on tension. Dean poured himself drink after drink, making toasts that sounded more like warnings. "To family," he said, raising his glass, eyes fixed on me. "No matter how much they test you, they're still yours." Everyone laughed politely. Later, when Emily took the kids upstairs, he leaned over and said quietly, "You could say thank you once in a while. You eat my food, sit at my table, and never a word of gratitude." I told him I had thanked Emily. "Emily?" he sneered. "Emily doesn't run this house. I do." That night he cornered me in the hallway. "You think you're clever," he said, his breath thick with whiskey. "You think if you keep playing the victim, someone's going to come rescue you. But nobody's coming, old man. Nobody cares about you but us, and even that's running thin." He jabbed his finger into my chest hard enough to make me stumble. "You better start showing some respect." I nodded, because nodding had become my only form of defense. He smirked, satisfied with his victory, and went upstairs. I went to bed shaking, but what kept me awake wasn't the fear. It was the realization that he was right about one thing. Nobody was coming, not unless I made them. December brought snow, and with it the illusion of quiet. The world outside was muffled and clean, but inside the house the noise never really stopped. Dean had found new ways to humiliate me. He unplugged the space heater in my room and told me it was drawing too much power. When I complained of the cold, he handed me a thin blanket from the hall closet and said, "Old bones like to complain. Keep moving, you'll warm up." One morning, I discovered my winter coat missing. "Must have gotten lost," he said, smirking, as he zipped up a brand-new jacket that looked suspiciously familiar. I told Emily, but she just sighed, her voice brittle. "I'll buy you another one, Dad. Don't make this a big deal." Then came the night he locked me out. It was just after Christmas. The children were asleep, the tree still glowing faintly in the living room. I had gone outside to throw away some trash, barefoot in my slippers, because I thought I'd be quick. When I tried the door, it was locked. I knocked softly at first, then louder. No answer. The lights went off inside, one by one, until only the faint blue flicker of the television remained. I stood there for a while, the cold biting through my thin robe, waiting for someone to remember I existed. Eventually I gave up and went around to the side of the house, sitting on the bench under the eaves. The snow fell in slow, relentless flakes, covering my hair, my shoulders, my shoes. By the time Emily found me in the morning, I couldn't feel my fingers. "Dad, why didn't you knock?" she cried. I wanted to tell her that I had. I wanted to tell her that her husband had looked right at me through the window before turning off the lights. But my lips were too stiff to form the words. I spent 2 days in bed, with a fever after that. Emily brought soup and medicine, whispering apologies I could barely hear. Dean didn't come down once. When I finally felt strong enough to sit up, I found a note taped to my door in his slanted handwriting. "Don't wander off at night. Not safe for you." I tore it down and flushed it down the toilet. Something inside me began to shift after that. The fear that had kept me silent was still there, but it was hollow now, worn thin by repetition. I stopped caring whether he liked me, whether Emily believed me. I started paying attention instead, to details, to timing, to opportunities. I learned when his parole officer visited, every other Tuesday morning, a man named Harris, who wore clean suits and carried a clipboard like a badge of judgment. Dean was always on his best behavior those days, sober, polite, eager to prove he was a model citizen. Once, as Harris left, I caught his eye through the window. He nodded politely. I nodded back. Something small and reckless sparked in me then, like the first flicker of heat in a frozen engine. The next escalation came not from Dean's hands, but from his mind. He began whispering to Emily that I was losing memory, that I was hiding money, that I'd once threatened him in my sleep. I overheard him late one night, his voice low but clear. "He needs help," he said. "It's not safe, Em. What if he forgets the stove on? What if he hurts the kids?" I pressed my ear to the wall, my heart hammering. Her answer came after a long silence. "Maybe we should talk to someone," she said quietly. That was when I realized he was preparing the ground to have me removed. He wanted me institutionalized, discredited, erased completely. A week later, the opportunity came for him to finish the job. It was a Sunday afternoon. Emily had taken the kids to a birthday party, leaving us alone. I was repairing a loose hinge on a cabinet when he came in, holding an envelope. "This came for you," he said, tossing it on the table. I saw the return address immediately, the VA Benefits Office. "Probably some paperwork," he said, leaning against the counter. "Want me to help you read it?" I told him I could manage. He smiled thinly. "Suit yourself." When I opened it, I saw it wasn't paperwork at all, but a notice confirming a recent withdrawal request from my account. A large one. The signature at the bottom wasn't mine. Before I could speak, he said, "Oh, that. Yeah, I needed to borrow some. Family emergency. You'll get it back." I stared at him. "You forged my name," I said quietly. He shrugged. "You'll get it back," he repeated. "We're family." I don't remember crossing the space between us, but suddenly I was standing toe-to-toe with him, shaking with something that wasn't quite rage, but wasn't fear anymore either. "You stole from me," I said. "You hit me, you lied about me, and now you steal from me." He smiled, a slow, dangerous smile. "You think anyone will believe you?" he said softly. "You can't even remember your pills half the time. Emily already thinks you're slipping. I'll tell them you're confused. They'll believe me." He moved closer, lowering his voice to a whisper. "Old men like you are ghosts waiting to happen." I turned to walk away, and that's when he struck me again. This time it wasn't a slap. It was a closed fist to the ribs, the same place he'd hit before. The pain was instant and deep, knocking the air out of me. I stumbled back, grabbing the counter for balance. "You shouldn't have said that," he muttered. I tasted bile, the world spinning. For a second, I thought he might hit me again. But then he froze, head cocked. There was a knock at the door. Loud, official. 3 short raps. "Parole check," a voice called. Dean went pale. For the first time in months, I saw fear flicker behind his eyes. He straightened his shirt, ran a hand through his hair, and hissed at me, "Say nothing." I didn't answer. When Harris stepped inside, clipboard in hand, his eyes swept over us both. "Everything all right here?" he asked. Dean forced a grin. "Of course. Just fixing a cabinet. Old man here likes to stay busy." I stood there, breathing carefully, feeling the bruise already blooming beneath my ribs. Harris's gaze lingered on me. "Sir, you okay?" he asked, voice steady but sharp. I hesitated. Dean's hand was resting on the back of my chair, just barely touching it, but the message was clear. Still, something in me broke then, the thin wall of silence I'd been building for nearly a year. "No," I said finally, my voice rasping like dry leaves. "I'm not okay." Dean laughed too loudly. "He's joking. Gets confused sometimes." But Harris wasn't looking at him anymore. He was looking at the bruises on my arms, the split in my lip, the way I held my side like it might come apart. "Sir," he said, "can you tell me what happened?" I opened my mouth, and for a second, the words wouldn't come. Then they did, all at once, tumbling out raw and uneven. I told him everything, the shoves, the threats, the nights locked outside, the forged signature, the bruise on my ribs that hadn't healed. I saw Dean's expression change from shock to fury to panic. Emily came home midway through my halting confession, standing frozen in the doorway as I spoke. Harris listened without interrupting, his jaw tight. When I finished, the room was silent, except for the ticking of the kitchen clock. "I'll need to make a call," Harris said quietly. Dean started to protest, but Harris raised a hand. "You know the conditions of your parole. Sit down." And just like that, the balance of the house shifted. It wasn't triumph I felt, not even relief, just a hollow ache where fear used to live. Emily's face was pale, her mouth trembling. "Dad," she whispered, "why didn't you tell me?" I looked at her and wanted to say, "Because I thought you already knew." But the words wouldn't come. That was the second escalation, the one that finally broke the silence wide open. Not a shout, not a blow, but a small, simple truth spoken too late and too quietly to stop the damage it left behind. The storm I had been waiting for had arrived, and though I didn't yet know what it would destroy, I knew at least that it would no longer be me alone bearing its weight. The house was silent in a way that felt unnatural, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The parole officer had left 2 hours earlier, taking Dean with him, his hands cuffed behind his back, his voice low and hoarse with threats that no longer landed the way they once had. I watched through the frosted glass as the cruiser turned out of the driveway and disappeared down the street, its taillights shrinking into the dark. The snow that had begun falling that morning still drifted in thin veils, coating the porch and softening the edges of the world. I stood there in my slippers, shaking from something deeper than cold, and for the first time in a year I couldn't hear his footsteps upstairs, his voice cutting through every quiet moment. The silence was almost unbearable. It was the sound of aftermath, the hollow echo left behind when fear finally vacates a place and doesn't know what to replace it with. Emily sat at the kitchen table, her hands clasped around a mug she wasn't drinking from. The kids were asleep at a neighbor's house. She'd sent them there after the officers came, too stunned to explain, just saying there'd been a misunderstanding. I could still see her face when she realized what was happening, how she had rushed forward as they read him his rights, pleading, "There must be a mistake." Even as the evidence lay scattered across the table, The forged documents, the bruises, the trembling in my voice. Her denial wasn't cruelty. I understood that now. It was the instinct of someone who had built her entire adult life around the hope that the man she loved could still change. But hope, I had learned, can become a form of blindness if you hold it too close for too long. She looked up at me finally, eyes red, face drained. "What happens now?" she asked. Her voice was small, almost childlike. I wanted to tell her I didn't know, but that wouldn't have been true. I knew exactly what would happen. Dean would be booked for parole violation, the assault charges would stick this time, and the man who had turned our home into a battlefield of whispers and bruises would be behind bars again. But none of that would undo what had already been done. The fear didn't vanish when the door closed behind him. It just lingered in the corners like smoke that refused to clear. I sat down across from her, every movement slow, deliberate, my ribs still aching from the last blow. "Now," I said, "we stop pretending." She covered her face with her hands and began to cry. Not the quick, shallow tears of embarrassment, but the deep kind that come from a place of broken certainty. "I didn't know," she said over and over. "I swear I didn't." I wanted to tell her she was lying, but I couldn't, because some part of me understood she was telling the truth as she saw it. She hadn't known, not really. She had chosen not to see, which is a different kind of ignorance, quieter and more corrosive. I reached across the table, my hand hovering above hers before finally settling, the gesture as much for me as for her. "It's done," I said. "It's over." But it wasn't over. The next day began the slow unraveling of everything that had held us together, even if that togetherness had been built on silence and fear. Officers came to take statements. Social workers asked questions that made the air feel heavy. I sat in the living room, recounting every detail I had tried so hard to bury. The first shove, the first insult, the night he locked me out in the snow. Each word I spoke felt like pushing a knife deeper into something that had once been called family. Emily sat in the corner, listening, her face pale, her hands gripping the edge of her chair. When they asked if she had ever witnessed the abuse, she shook her head. "No," she whispered. "I didn't see." One of the officers nodded, jotting something in his notebook, but I caught his look. He knew. We all did. Seeing and not seeing are often the same sin, just performed at different distances. That night, after they left, I packed a small bag. I wasn't told to go, but I understood that I needed to. The house felt like a carcass of something long dead, and I couldn't stay among its bones. Emily came to my room as I was folding my few shirts. "Dad, please don't," she said. "We can fix this. I'll make things right." Her voice trembled with exhaustion and guilt. I zipped the bag slowly, listening to the sound, like it was punctuation. "You can't fix it," I said quietly. "You can only stop pretending it didn't happen." She sank onto the chair, staring at the floor. "He'll lose everything," she whispered. "He already has," I said. "So have we." I left before dawn. The snow had stopped, and the sky was the color of ash. I walked to the end of the street, each step an act of deliberate detachment. My breath made small clouds in the air, and my hands, gripping the handle of the old duffel, trembled not from cold, but from something like release. There was no triumph in me, no satisfaction, only the deep, aching quiet that comes after a long illness breaks and leaves you hollow. I went to the Veterans Center downtown, a squat brick building that smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant. The man at the desk, a retired sergeant with a kind face, recognized me from years before when I used to volunteer there. "Rough night?" he asked. I nodded, and for the first time, I told someone the whole truth without hesitation. He listened without interruption, then said, "We'll find you a place." They gave me a small room in a shared housing facility, clean but plain, with a narrow bed and a window that looked out over the river. I slept for nearly 12 hours that first night, my body too exhausted to remember fear. When I woke, the light was already spilling across the floor, and for a moment I forgot where I was. Then it came back, all of it, and I lay there listening to the distant hum of traffic, the muffled voices in the hall, realizing that this was the first morning in a long time that I hadn't had to measure my breath around someone else's anger. Days passed in a blur of routine and paperwork. There were meetings with social workers, phone calls from the police, polite inquiries from lawyers who wanted statements. Emily called twice. The first time she said nothing but cried. The second time she told me Dean's hearing was scheduled for the end of the month. "He says he's sorry," she murmured. I said nothing. She waited, then added, "He asked me to tell you that." "Then tell him I heard," I said, and ended the call. I don't think forgiveness means pretending nothing happened. I think it means looking straight at what did happen and refusing to let it dictate who you become. It was during one of my follow-up visits to the center that I saw Harris again, the parole officer. He approached me in the hallway, his face less formal now, more human. "You did the right thing," he said. "I've seen men like him before. They don't stop until someone makes them." I wanted to believe him, but right still felt like a foreign word. "It doesn't feel right," I said. "It just feels empty." He nodded. Sometimes that's what right feels like at first. A few weeks later, I received a letter from Emily. It was handwritten, the paper smudged in places as though she'd pressed too hard with the pen. She said she was sorry for everything, that she had known in her heart something was wrong, but had been too afraid to face it. She told me the kids missed me, that Grace had started seeing a counselor, that Sam had stopped sleeping through the night. "They're asking questions," she wrote. "I don't know what to tell them." I folded the letter carefully and put it in the drawer beside my bed. Some things don't need answers right away. Some questions are better left waiting until the truth no longer feels like a weapon. As the days turned to weeks, the bruises faded, but the ache in my ribs lingered, a physical reminder of everything that had been broken and everything that had survived. Sometimes, late at night, I'd hear the river moving outside my window, a steady low murmur like a voice too patient to raise itself. I thought of Margaret then, of how she used to say that water always finds its level, no matter how many obstacles you place in its way. I realized that's what I was doing, finding my level again, learning how to exist in a world where survival wasn't the same as silence. When Dean's sentencing came, I didn't attend. I stayed in my room, staring out at the gray river and the distant bridge where headlights moved like tiny constellations. Emily called afterward. "He got 3 years, she said. Her voice was flat, expressionless. He wanted to plead for leniency, but the judge said his record spoke louder than his words. I didn't ask for details. "Are you okay?" I asked instead. She hesitated. "I don't know," she said finally. "The house feels empty." I almost laughed, not out of cruelty, but because emptiness was something I knew intimately. "It's supposed to," I said softly. "That's what happens when the noise leaves. You'll get used to the quiet." After the call ended, I sat for a long time without moving, the phone still in my hand. Outside the light shifted, and for a brief moment the water caught fire from the setting sun, a line of gold running across its surface. It faded quickly, but it was enough. That's what redemption looks like, I think. Not some grand victory or public forgiveness, but a small flicker of clarity in a long stretch of darkness. For months I had been surviving on fear, on the hope that if I stayed quiet enough, the world would leave me in peace. Now I understood that peace wasn't given. It was claimed, sometimes painfully, sometimes at great cost. That night, before I went to bed, I wrote one last letter to Margaret. "It's over," I wrote. "He's gone. Emily's finding her way back to herself. The kids are safe. And me, I'm still here. A little smaller, maybe, but not gone. I think you'd be proud." I folded it carefully and placed it in the shoebox with the others. Then I turned off the light and let the dark settle around me, not as something to fear, but as something earned. For the first time in a long while, I slept without dreaming of footsteps or fists or doors that would not open. When I woke, the morning light filled the room completely, and for once, it felt like it belonged to me. Spring came slowly that year, as if the earth itself was learning how to breathe again after holding too much ice inside it. From the window of my small room at the veterans' home, I could see the river beginning to thaw, the surface cracking open in long, silent seams that shimmered when the morning sun touched them. It was strange how the sound of melting could feel like forgiveness. Each day, I walked a little farther along the embankment, the pain in my ribs a dull companion, not sharp anymore, just an echo. I would stop sometimes and watch the water carry broken branches downstream, and it struck me that maybe people are not so different. We drift until something stronger than us decides where we will rest. The world had grown quieter in ways that no longer frightened me. I still woke early out of habit and made coffee in the small communal kitchen. The other men there, a few my age, some younger, greeted me with nods, brief but warm. We didn't talk much about the past. The veterans' home was full of men who carried invisible shrapnel in their memories, and we understood the value of silence that wasn't born of fear. I spent most mornings in the small library where the shelves smelled faintly of paper and dust, and sometimes, when the light came in just right, it almost looked like the house I had left, before it had turned into something else entirely. Emily called every Sunday now. At first, her voice was cautious, full of pauses, as though she expected me to hang up at any moment. But slowly, week by week, the conversations grew longer. She told me the kids were seeing a counselor, that Grace had joined the school choir, and Sam had started playing basketball again. There were apologies still hidden in every sentence, but I didn't need them spoken aloud. Guilt was a kind of grief, and she was still walking through hers. I listened more than I spoke, and when she asked if I hated her, I said no. Hate was a luxury I no longer had energy for. "You made mistakes," I told her, "but you're trying to make them right now. That's more than most ever do." She cried quietly on the other end of the line, and I imagined her sitting in that same kitchen where everything had come apart, the walls probably repainted, the sounds different, but the air still carrying the faint ghost of what we'd all survived. One afternoon, a letter arrived in my mailbox. The envelope was addressed in handwriting I didn't recognize at first, careful, slightly slanted, as though the writer had taken too long between each word. Inside was a drawing, a house, a river, and a man sitting on a bench beneath a tree, drawn in a child's uneven lines. Beneath it, in crooked letters, it said, "I miss you, Grandpa. I saw a bird with a red chest and thought of you." No signature was needed. I sat with the drawing in my hands for a long time, the edges soft from the warmth of my fingers. It wasn't redemption exactly, but it was something close, a reminder that love, when it's real, finds its way through even the thickest silence. Sometimes, the other residents would ask why I wrote so often. They saw me in the evenings at the small desk by the window, pen moving slowly across yellow paper. I told them it helped me think. What I didn't tell them was that I was still writing to Margaret, the only person who had ever known how to listen without fixing, without judging. The letters had changed, though. They weren't confessions anymore, not lists of bruises or apologies for weakness. They were simple observations about the weather, the river, the way the air smelled just before rain. I told her about Grace's letter, about Emily's calls, about the coffee that tasted slightly burnt but comforting all the same. I told her that I was learning to forgive people who hadn't asked for forgiveness, and that I was finally learning how to belong to myself again. In April, I received a notice from the court. Dean's appeal had been denied. He would serve the remainder of his sentence without parole. I read the letter once, folded it, and placed it in a drawer without ceremony. There was no satisfaction in it, no sense of victory, only the quiet knowledge that justice, when it comes, is less a shout than a whisper. The man who had broken so much in me was now confined to a cage of his own making, and I had no need to visit him there, not even in thought. A few weeks later, Emily came to see me. It was the first time since that night. She looked older, thinner, but there was a steadiness in her I hadn't seen before. We sat by the river, the same one I watched every morning, and for a while we didn't speak. Then she said, "I sold the house." Her voice didn't waver. I couldn't stay there. It didn't feel like ours anymore. I nodded. She looked out at the water. "The kids want you to visit," she said. "They keep asking when you'll come." I smiled, not with joy, but with something deeper. Relief, maybe. "When the time's right," I said. "Not yet." She understood. Some distances need to remain open for a while, like a wound that has to breathe before it can close. That night after she left, I sat by the window and watched the lights from the bridge flicker on, one by one. I thought about the strange arithmetic of love and suffering, how the two so often coexist until one finally exhausts the other. I thought about all the men who live entire lives swallowing their pain until it calcifies inside them, and how easy it is for silence to masquerade as dignity. And then I thought about the moment I told Harris the truth, how small it had felt at the time, how insignificant. But it had saved me. It had broken the chain of generations that passed down the belief that enduring cruelty is the same as preserving peace. In the veterans' home, the nights came early and the halls were always dim, but I had come to like that. Darkness, I'd realized, isn't the enemy. It's what makes the light visible when it finally appears. I would sit with a book, or sometimes just watch the shadow of the river move across the far wall, and I found myself breathing in rhythm with it, steady and calm. One evening, I went out onto the small veranda that overlooked the water. The air smelled of rain and new grass. Somewhere in the distance, someone was playing a harmonica, the notes thin but sure, drifting across the water like a voice speaking to no one in particular. I closed my eyes and thought about Margaret again, about the way she used to hum under her breath while washing dishes, about the way she'd touch my arm just once before saying something that mattered. I thought about Emily as a little girl, running through the yard with her hair flying behind her like a banner, and about Grace and Sam, who still had time to unlearn the fear they'd been shown. For a long time, I'd believed my story had ended in that house, with the bruises, the silence, the shame. But as I stood there listening to the harmonica fade, I understood something simple and true. The story only ends when you stop telling it. When I went back inside, I turned off the light, left the window open a crack, and let the sound of the river fill the room. The air was cool, clean, new. I lay down on the narrow bed and closed my eyes, not to forget, but to rest. Somewhere outside, a bird began to sing, hesitant at first, then certain. And for the first time in years, I felt not just alive, but whole, as if every quiet, broken piece of me had finally found its place.